I'm delighted to introduce our speaker this morning and our interlocutor, Alex. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you so much, Kelsey, and thanks to all of you for being here this evening, not only to enjoy this spectacular program, this unique opportunity to enter into and explore a Philadelphia landmark, but to help the Rosenbach inaugurate this new transatlantic partnership, which is a significant development and a way for us to showcase our collections and work closely with institutions all around the world to celebrate history, literature, and culture. This evening, I'm in the company of a very distinguished scholar to talk about issues that shaped American life in the early 20th century and continue to shape American and global life today. Ethnicity, identity, religion, class, politics, and cultural memory, as these issues relate to two of the most famous families in American history and in Irish history, the Kellys of Philadelphia and the Kennedys of Boston. I cannot imagine a more appropriate place to have this particular conversation than here in the beautiful drawing room of the Kelly house. Mary, thank you so much for coming to Philadelphia and for being a part of this program this evening.
Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here. Thank you to the Rosenbach, to Kelly Home, to the Princess Grace Ireland Library in Monaco. It's an honor to just list all of those institutions one after another. And I will simply say it's one thing to write a book, but the real difficulty is getting it into people's hands. So I thoroughly appreciate that you've done this evening. Thank you.
It is our specialty at the Rosenbach, getting books into people's hands. So I would like to begin by posing a few questions to myself, having read your wonderful book, which I'm so excited for everyone in our community this evening also to be able to read. I'll ask my questions, and then we'll save some time at the end for all of you to pose your questions as well. So let's start off by establishing some context. In your book, you discuss the diverse identities that the Irish have possessed in American life over the centuries. Can you give us a general sense of who the Kellys were and how they emerged into prominence locally and nationally?
Sure. So I guess I'll start with the first Kelly in America. That's John Henry Kelly. That was Grace's grandfather. He was born in the famine year. This is kind of an important detail. So the famine ran from 1845 to 52. He was born in 1847, 2 years into it, which is no small thing. And he left the west coast of Ireland, Mayo, and we'll get back to Mayo as well because Grace is very much remembered there. He left Mayo 20 years later. He landed, when you ask me about diverse Irish identities, he landed in a Philadelphia in which it was very, very difficult to be Irish and Catholic and a refugee of the famine. He wouldn't have been a refugee. I think the worst of it was over, but still the famine initiated a massive wave of Irish Catholic immigration. When the Irish Catholics arrived, they would have met a lot of hostility from, I suppose you could say Anglo-Protestants. Of course, some of the worst hostility they would have met were from people who knew them already, and that would have been the first Irish cohort. That was here in Philadelphia particularly. These would have been, I suppose they would have been come to be called the Scots-Irish in America. So Ulster Scots, Presbyterians, who had left Ireland in droves in the 18th century for various reasons we can get into later maybe. He meets a difficult world with a lot of prejudice, and I think that I suppose what I explored in my book was the degree to which traces of that prejudice persist to a small degree even into Grace's lifetime. And my argument in the book, which we will get to, I hope, is that Grace herself was part of how, particularly her wedding, this globally visible ascent to royal status, how this transforms Irish Catholic America and allows the Irish to finally break the kinds of barriers that had been, in front of them, really, for a while.
So what do you think Grace Kelly's rise to global fame and prominence meant for the rest of Catholic Irish America?
So I've actually put in some images. Some of them are taken from the book, and I'm going to be looking at them a little bit to sort of think about that rise. The very first one I draw your attention to is the comic Valentine. So the beauty of Ireland, who's down here. And she is, when I say she's a comic Valentine, beauty is a little bit of a joke. So the idea of Irish beauty is pretty much a contested category in this 19th century comic Valentine. Why that is that the famine wave that John Henry is part of, the women who came over in that wave, they tended to become maids. And such was the prejudice against Irish women that they were referred to as Bridgets. There was a name for them, which suggested they had no individuality, which suggested they were interchangeable. And so the stereotype of Bridget was that she scared the mistress of the house. She was loud, she was boisterous, she was unskilled, she was a terrible cook. She was prone to tossing the food on the floor if she had was in a bad mood and so on. So this notion of Irish women not quite making the cut. Again, there's an image from Time magazine here. So when Grace is making it in Hollywood, this is a 1955 cover she has, and there's the sort of the trace of that prejudice against what it was effectively probably the most beautiful woman in the world at that time. There's a quotation, I'm going to read it out in that Time magazine piece. Publicists tag Miss Kelly a mainline debutante. Do I have to explain the mainline here? I don't think so. Okay. Basically, the mainline was the other side of the river from here, associated with, people in the social register, the established Anglo families and so on. So publicists tag Miss Kelly a mainline debutante, but she is neither mainline nor debutante, but she's the next thing to both. Now that's subtly cutting. All of that, of course, disappears once she becomes royal, but even into 1955, I think, we see the traces of the prejudice.
You make the case that Grace Kelly's greatest performance, so to speak, of her lifetime was in Monaco in 1956, the year of her wedding. How did her marriage transform Irish-American identity? So I've got the MGM poster there, which I absolutely love. So it was one of the largest media events of the 1950s. It was broadcast live by MGM, and the audience was 30 million people. It also had an impact in Ireland. I said I'd go back to Mayo, where John Henry was from. So Mayo on the west coast, and Galway, where I'm from as well to a degree, there is a very old custom of lighting bonfires to celebrate a massive event involving one of your own. So if the local team wins the national championship or so on, there'll be a bonfire and everybody will gather. All over Mayo, on the day that Grace Kelly married, there were bonfires. So she was being claimed as one of their own. I think one other thing I love as well is that into the 1950s, Irish women wore formal day dresses to get married. They could be any colour. These were modest women who wanted to reuse their finery, right, for their Sunday best later. Right after Grace Kelly married, suddenly everybody was wearing white all over Ireland. So again, I think it's that this woman of modest roots who's transforming to royalty, ordinary Irish women could absolutely identify with her. And we'll be talking about Jackie Kennedy as well. Jackie Kennedy and Grace Kelly were absolute icons to Irish women. They absolutely adored them. And I think on some level they identified, or wanted to identify them, or could identify with them. They could access that kind of elite because the roots were similar, because Jackie was 7/8 Irish as well. We may get to that too. A perfect segue to my next question. I want to move northwards from Philadelphia to Boston. Tell us about the history of the Kennedy family and why, in your book, you associate the Kennedys with the concept of the Gothic. We at the Rosenbach know a lot about the Gothic because of the nature of our collections, and I was very intrigued that you used that concept in discussing their cultural history.
Yeah, so I'll just segue into that by mentioning something, just one image I forgot, which is Grace taking communion during the wedding. That was very, very important because it made it an explicitly Catholic global event. Catholicism had been considered the religion of poor immigrants in America. So that was important. And I think as well, think about what that did. It conjoined the idea of Irishness in America with royalty, right? Irish Catholicism and royalty, which I argue allowed people to imagine it paved the way for the family who become known as America's royals. And that is, of course, the Kennedys, who are very, very Gothicized. So I'll get to the Gothic now. So I suppose, as a literature scholar primarily, I approach history in terms of how people tell themselves the stories of history. So Grace is the fairy tale. But if Grace is the fairy tale, then the Kennedys, after JFK's assassination, their story gets told as Gothic nightmare. And so Gothic, I'll just explain what that is. Gothic is, if you've seen Saltburn lately, that's Gothic. Dracula is Gothic. It's where trauma returns, the dead returns, sins are uncovered, conspiracy happens, secrets are uncovered. It's always about power and its abuse. So after JFK's assassination, Gothic seemed to fit competing conspiracy theories about the Kennedys. And I'm going to just read you a list of the attributes of the very first Gothic novel, which was an 18th century English novel. And you'll see it continues on down today, to Saltburn, to a huge extent, to Dracula, and so on. And you'll also see, as I'm reading these attributes of Gothic, think about how the Kennedys have been framed in journalistic and cultural accounts since, the assassinations, I'll say plural with Robert as well. So with the 18th century Gothic, there is a corrupt Catholic elder who's kind of controlling everything from behind the scenes. There's a cursed line or a corrupt bloodline. There's sexual excess. There's an endangered, beautiful woman always at the heart of the narrative. And there's disrupted inheritance or murdered heirs. So you begin to see where this is going. So for both sides of the political divide, the Kennedys fit the Gothic mold. For liberals, they were the innocent, idealistic victims of dark conspiracies. And for conservatives, they were, as America's royals, they were typical of kind of aristocratic corruption. Of course, you can imagine that Joe Sr. himself was often cast as, the sort of the elder who's behind the power. And Jacqueline, when Jacqueline appears right after her husband is assassinated, crawling in her bloodied suit, in that moment, she becomes, for a global audience again, Gothic's, endangered, beautiful woman. So the official portrait of Jacqueline, which is, she looks very, very ethereal, very, very eerie. She's actually wearing an Irish designer linen gown there. We can talk about that later, maybe. But I would it be okay if I read 2 or 3 lines from the book? This is, I'm just going to read a portion where I think clothing is particularly important when thinking about Princess Grace and Jacqueline. And this is, I think, the pivot from fairy tale to Gothic, if I can see it in the wonderful dim light we have here. So if Grace Kelly's pristine white bridal gown signified the fairy tale for Irish America, then its Gothic inverse is the First Lady's white leather gloves, so stiff with her husband's blood in the wake of his assassination that she had to be assisted in their removal. Deeply cognizant of the power of image from her years as one of the most photographed women in the world, Jacqueline Kennedy refused to change out of the bloodied pink suit as soon as the opportunity arose, and this was a conscious choice. A white dress into which to change had been laid out in the presidential quarters on Air Force One when Jackie boarded after the assassination, and the colour, of course, was meant to mitigate the horror. However, when she reappeared for the hurried swearing in of Johnston, she was still defiantly wearing the bespattered suit, and her stockings remained saturated with blood. When Lady Bird Johnson urged the new widow to change, Jackie refused by saying, quote, I want them to see what they've done to Jack. Yeah.
To sum up, how would you characterize the social and cultural relationship of the Kellys and the Kennedys, and what is their lasting legacy for Irish and American life today?
So I think I think the fairy tale persists, in popular culture in terms of images of Princess Grace, particularly around the wedding, right? That still persists. I think the Kennedys have only become more Gothicized since the death of JFK Jr. It seemed to sort of reinforce, especially as he had the exact same name, and he too died prematurely. I think Ireland, particularly in Mayo, I was in Mayo last summer, and I bought a Princess Grace fridge magnet in Newport. So Mayo still idealizes Grace Kelly, Princess Grace, especially Newport. I'd urge you all to go visit Newport, which is where Dromuirla is the townland John Henry was from. And Irish women, as I said, really look up to her. I think JFK's, actually one final little detail about Dromuirla that I love is that the townland, as I said, where her grandfather hailed, she purchased the cottage in 1976 and intended to develop it as a holiday home. On her death in 1982, the locals in the village went to the land around the cottage and gathered wildflowers and sent them to Monaco for the funeral. So that'll give you a sense of the deep feeling for her and her family in Mayo. I'll finish with, are we good for time? Yeah. So I'll finish with the image of JFK, the mosaic, which is the top corner here. So JFK visited Ireland. Grace visited Ireland, actually, an official state visit in 1961. That's her at the ancestral cottage on the other side. But John F. Kennedy visited in June 1963, of course, just a few short months before his death. And in pious Ireland, very Catholic at the time, JFK was kind of remade as a secular saint. So this mosaic is from Galway Cathedral. Galway Cathedral was built 2 years after his visit. And to memorialize the slain president, this is a tiny icon of a very pious praying JFK looking upwards at a very large risen Christ. And I suppose I'll conclude by saying that, people have accused JFK of being many things in his life, but he could never be accused of being a saint.
Well, on that note, I have no further questions, but I would like to invite our audience to pose questions of their own. We are, as you all know, recording this event to share with our friends in Ireland and Monaco. So if you have a question, please raise your hand and I'll bring you the microphone and I'll ask you to ask it into the microphone. Do we have any questions for our presenter?
I'm confused. You mentioned Mayo.
Yes.
And Monaco. They were sending something from Mayo.
So the Dromuirla is the very tiny village or townland that John Henry Kelly was from, Grace's grandfather. And Grace had visited his homestead in 1961 and had purchased it actually in 1976. So she was known there. The family were remembered there. So when she died in 1982, the locals, they gathered wildflowers in the fields around his cottage, which is a beautiful gesture, I think, and sent them to Monaco.
So it's a wonderful admixture between the Kennedys and the Kellys then, in that respect, as far as Ireland.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they're both very, very much remembered. Both state visits are the 61 visit by Grace and the 63 visit by John F. Kennedy were referred to as homecomings, were considered homecomings. They were very much claimed. And it was the return of the son and the daughter. That was absolutely the attitude.
Did the families intermingle at all?
Well, there's a nice photo here. I love this photo. This is a 1961 luncheon in the White House of the Prince and Princess of Monaco. It's 1 month before Princess Grace actually goes to Ireland on her state visit. So I think she was starting her Irish tour by going to the White House to meet the first Catholic Irish-American president. I do believe. And she wore a Givenchy, I guess, green suit to that luncheon. It was described as lime green. And when she wore it again on arrival in Dublin, it was suddenly emerald green, according to the Associated Press.
Any other questions? Well, I'll hand the microphone.
What types of, one-offs or put-downs did the Kelly family experience? Despite being successful and athletic, what did they experience?
So there's an interesting anecdote about John B. Kelly, Grace's father, which sports journalists in particular seem to love. I found it in various accounts of his sporting career. So he was a national rowing champion in the U.S. When he was young, and he applied to row at Henley in England, which is rowing's most prestigious event. His application was rejected, and he was told it was because he had done manual labour, and that this contravened their definition of an amateur. What I find interesting is there may have been good reasons. Possibly, I looked at the rules, possibly it did, but I think what's more interesting from the point of view of the family's history and more broadly the history of their ethnic cohort is that people believed it was prejudice, at the time, this rejection.
Thank you.
Thank you. I saw another hand over here.
I just wanted to make a comment. I thought your talk was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you very much.
I had high expectations. You exceeded all of them. You brought those families to life. It was a great pleasure.
Thank
it
you
is
very
a great
much.
pleasure listening to you.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's what we like to hear at the Rosenbach. Other questions or comments? Well, hearing none, why don't we give a round of applause to our guest
Thank you, Alex,
speaker.
for the wonderful questions.